No census form? No problem. Complete your census from anywhere. Fill out the census now at my2020census.gov.
G'day guys, today we're going to be talking to Anthony Miranda. He's one of the 5 candidates running for Queen's Borough President. So thank you very much for joining me today, Mr. Miranda. First of all, you've spent a life in public in terms of law enforcement and various community, events and things. What's prompting you to run now for Queen's Borough President?
I mean, it's more than just law enforcement. I think what prompted me to run for Queen's Borough President was the fact that there were no independent candidates that were running at the time. Mm-hmm. We had elected officials who already had some of them 8 years or 12 years worth of running for city council or being part of city council who didn't make the changes that our community needed. So the desire to run for Queen's Borough President is about having a voice that truly represents the interests of the community. And I'm a parent. I live here in Queens. My children go to school here in Queens. I says, I'm like all the other parents, just fed up with politicians that were making promises and never keeping them.
Right.
They didn't see the community with the majority of changes that are being made. We're left out of the conversation. So again, I do 30 plus years of community advocacy work. And so it was time to run for Queen's Borough President. When I was asked would I be interested, I said, absolutely. The time and an opportunity for change. Now even more so than when I first decided. It's an opportunity for change, and you have to have people leading that are going to be willing to have the fights that are in front of us. And right. I didn't see that in any of the candidates that were running. Again, like I said, they had the opportunity to make the changes and basically have failed our communities. So I'm just like all the other community residents, tired of politicians and politics as usual.
I hear you. So listen, obviously the police are, in conversation a great deal at the moment. With the, horrible death of George Floyd, and then also some of these protests that some would say have got out of hand. What do you think should be done in terms of police reform, police defunding? I mean, it's become very, very topical right now.
So let's say I'm not new to this struggle, right? For the last 30 years, we have filed class action lawsuits against the police department for discriminating against minority members of the force, right? Black and Hispanic officers. We've also assisted and testified as expert witnesses on cases that involve community residents that were victims of police brutality. So now we face the time that we're in right now. There is a need for the changes and the reform. But again, the last case was 6 years ago. And what happened from 6 years ago when we first heard the first cries of I can't breathe till now? Changes weren't there. The reforms, the introduction of bills, those things did happen. There was an outcry from the community, but there was never such a strong movement as we have right now. So police reform and accountability, absolutely. And I gave concrete examples of changes that need to be made, that can be made immediately, that we don't have to wait for. Appointing and fighting for a special prosecutor to oversee, that's over the police department, over the district attorney's office. That's an impartial bearer of fact, hero of facts. That the police officers feel comfortable and the community absolutely can have faith that they will have a fair trial to have all the information presented. A permanent independent prosecutor to investigate cases of police brutality and death in police custody. We talked about empowering CCRB. It's not a new conversation. CCRB currently does investigations and makes recommendations. After they do investigation, they make a recommendation for a penalty, and the police commissioner has the choice of imposing it or not imposing it. So we need to move from recommendations to actually implementing the penalties that have been recommended by that are imposed by CCRB. That's a different conversation.
What about the defunding discussion? The $6 billion to potentially $5 billion. What are your thoughts on that?
Again, I think it's a political and politicians' conversation that they coined a phrase called defunding, which misrepresents the facts. These are the facts. These politicians are the ones that approved the budgets that gave the police department all the revenue that it currently has. Now they're the same ones screaming about reform, right? They're disingenuous and they don't represent the interests of the community because they're the ones who gave the police department all that. But let's also see how the police department became so big. They took over the housing police department. They took over the transit police department. They took over school safety officers. They took over traffic enforcement agents. They also started there was conversation recently to taking over the Taxi and Limousine Commission as well. So they took over all these budgets and all these agencies, and now you have one huge agency, as they say.
Mm.
So what part are you want to define? Which part of the city are you trying to say would be most vulnerable right now? And now they make us think that we have to choose between funding the police and funding our social service programs, summer youth employment program, healthcare. Guess what? Fund those programs. You had a responsibility to do that. If those programs have been cut all these years, who were they cut by? They were cut by the same people who were running for Queens Borough President. They're the ones who voted on those budgets and voted on those cuts. Mm. So again, disingenuous and misrepresentation of information. They're cute with their slogans, but they are not the people that need to be in front of us right now in this very crucial time and saying, hold police officers accountable. But holding police officers accountable doesn't mean that we have to sacrifice our safety. Everybody in the community wants their children to be safe. They want their parents to feel safe. They want to feel safe every day. Hold the officers accountable to the job that they've enlisted to do. Absolutely.
Yeah,
and then fund them properly so that they can reach those goals.
All right, interesting. The coronavirus, you touched on that briefly. It's hit Queens extremely tough. What do you think can be done to protect people here in Queens from, say, potentially a second wave or a pandemic like it in the future?
Again, first I want to talk about what transpired already. What we saw was a lack of leadership. Entire Queens political leadership just didn't respond collectively and in a unified manner to be able to address the concerns of our residents. Many of us lost family members. I lost my sister-in-law. I had my wife that got sick to the coronavirus and she recovered. But we suffered what happened in our communities. These elected officials, none of them were part of the conversation when these services were being introduced to our areas. And in fact, many of them after the fact said that it was done in a bias, in a racial manner, discriminatory manner. And I said, where were you at the beginning of the conversation? So as Queens Borough President, you have to be a part of the conversation about what's going to happen and planning for the future, making sure that we have adequate partnerships, that all parts of our communities are being served fairly and equally.
If you were the Borough President on March 1st, what sort of action would have you taken?
Well, first thing, Borough President's one of the responsibilities is to organize all our elected officials and be that voice for all of Queens. Mm-hmm. During the entire pandemic, we did not have one unified Queens voice about the services and how they were going to be introduced to our communities. I would have gotten the city council, the state representatives, the assembly, and the congressional leaders together and say, we're going to pool our resources. And we're going to have a unified presentation. I don't need to stand in front of these press conferences, but I can hold all of them accountable to making sure there's one message. Ask all the residents of Queens. Each of our elected officials went on their own agendas, their own Zoom calls, their own presentations, crying about things that went wrong, but they failed in leadership. Leadership would have led from the front and organized all our, and then discretionary funds at all levels of government. We could have pooled our resources and gotten the PPE equipment that was necessary for the hospital workers and to the families in the communities. That didn't happen. And then I had to go out on my own and we distributed close to 100,000 masks to all the areas of Queens, to the hospitals, to some of the precincts that were lacking, and to the community residents.
Wow.
That was the responsibility of those people who are elected to represent us.
Okay.
They failed.
Well, look, the next chapter, God willing, if everybody remains healthy, is the economy and getting jobs, etc. You know, how would you look at an Amazon type of scenario or a big company looking to, you know, develop and create jobs here in Queens?
The strongest base that we have to creating sustainable jobs in our community is supporting the small business owners. We had a Small Business Survival Act bill that's been introduced to the City Council that's probably been there more than 10 years. Why do they have to wait that long to get some substantive relief so that they can be stabilized in our community? We've been losing hundreds of thousands of small businesses in the borough of Queens. Unnecessary, because there's been no overall plan from the Queens Borough President's Office that can organize all our elected officials to how do we support the small business owners and how do we account for those jobs. Again, it's about creating, sometimes it's not just government employment, it's creating creative partnerships with people in private industry to saying how we can now reintroduce people to a new workforce. And it's going to be training, it's going to be part of education, but it's a plan that has a solid plan. When they talked about defunding the summer youth program, I can almost guarantee you that it says in the plan, you got to plan these things ahead and have to have the foresight to think that the future has a positive view. For our positive view, I said, I think I can create enough business partnerships to make sure that we have more employment of our summer youth here in Queens than in any other time in history.
Right. Okay. Well, in terms of getting back to sort of business and development, how will you look at, though, from a land use standpoint, the community board person has ULIP control, advisors in terms of rezonings. How will you look at these things in terms of like a Flushing waterfront, a Long Island City development potentially in the future? What will you look for?
So first thing I think we would do is freeze any luxury development that's going on in our community and have a feasibility study about what the strain would be on local resources, because nobody's done that job. They build and drop in projects in the middle of communities, but they haven't done the infrastructure. What is going to be the strain on the sewer system that we have, the emergency response, the education system when we drop hundreds of families without properly planning? So that's the first thing I would do to make sure that we have these feasibility studies to see what the impacts are. As when it comes to community boards, I think we need to have more diversity. These are not life-term positions. We need to have an openness to a process, and I think the Queensborough president failed in that responsibility. City councilmen like to say that all the problems we have, the Queensborough president did it. But that's not true. The Queensborough president in the past has left it to city council people to make those appointments and never question them. I feel as the Queensborough president, we centralize that process, have everybody apply. Everybody gets a response back to why they either received the position or did not, and we ensure that they're qualified for the position.
Another discussion that people are having right now, especially as the budget gets tighter and the city's going to be struggling for funds, it would seem, is Rikers Island. Do you think that the city should go ahead with shutting down Rikers Island and building the borough-based jails right now and into the future, given the shortfall of money, potentially?
Okay, well, if we face a financial crisis, then I think all those decisions will be revisited.
Mm-hmm.
But as it stands, the city councilmen already made those decisions for us. They said that Rikers Island will not be rebuilt. You will not build any new jails on Rikers Island. This is already the law that they passed and put in place. So we're left now with trying to address the issues that impact our communities with the current guidelines that are in place, which says Rikers Island will not have a jail. They identified borough-based jails, but they still failed to engage the community in that process and figure out whether that community is even wanted in the areas and what the local impact would be on community residents as well. So, and we also understand that there was horrific conditions that were going on in Rikers Island, that the system failed us. But this is what they didn't address. They addressed bail reform, which is the front end, and they addressed the jails that are the tail end. What they didn't address was the meat and potatoes of the criminal justice system that caused these things to happen. If you empowered the judges and had more judges, as a matter of fact, you had more judges that looked like us, people of color, then perhaps they would feel more comfortable with the sentencing. Because as we found, they have already had documented many cases of unfair sentencing because the judges didn't exercise their power in an impartial manner.
But do you think what Albany passed, earlier in the year, or that went into effect, I guess, at the beginning of the year in terms of bail reform, do you think that went far enough?
No, again, bail reform is the end. Incarceration are the ends of the system, the beginning of the system and the end of the system.
But I thought bail reform, though, was that if you get arrested, rather than being held, you, in many instances, would be able to, get a ticket and then come back at a later date for your trial. Wasn't that the purpose of it?
Yes, and bail reform, again, it shouldn't be a thing. It was to address the fact that the bail system was biased, right? Because some people could buy themselves out of the system and other people couldn't afford to. That's what it was meant to address. Yeah. But it was also as a result of the reason they pushed so hard, because our community didn't have faith in the judges that are making these decisions in between, because they found them to be biased in those decisions. That's why we ran judicial delegates all over the borough of Queens this year. Why? Because they're the ones who are going to select the judges that are up for promotions. It's the judicial delegates, it's not the community. We have ran judges for the community to be able to support them. Remember, we ran the first Latina ever elected as a judge here in Queens against the Queens machine. It was never done before. So we can't afford to have business as usual, political machines dictating what happens. We have to engage our community and empower people beyond my term as Queensborough president. It's leaving hundreds, if not thousands of people of the community empowered to make the changes that we've been asking for so long.
Okay, all right, terrific. Listen, just to wrap it up, we've covered a lot of the main points, but transportation is often brought up. Queens, a transit desert. What do you think can be done about public transportation, assuming that life gets back to normal and people are willing to use it?
First, I don't think we want life to get back to normal. I think we want a better life. And I think we have the opportunity to improve the system so we don't have to go back to business as usual, but we need to have a different view of what our future looks like. And transportation has been a curse for Queens for quite some time. But in the Queensborough President's Office, you can have an overall plan that addresses all the issues of Queens, not one community versus another, but actually looks at the entire picture and connectivity between buses and trains and alternate means of transportation as well. There has to be a coordinated effort. And then you have to be able to fight against the MTA, which we currently don't have a position on the MTA board. However, there is a bill that has been introduced to give a position to the Queensborough presidents so that they can have a seat at the table and have a real impact on those decisions going forward. But it has generally not been at the table of the Queensborough president other than organizing. And the Queensborough president has not had an overall plan and part of their office to see this as a systemic problem and address it in a holistic manner. And I think that's what we look for differently.
Okay. But what would you want to see in terms of transportation? Are you talking trains, buses? Where would they be? Where would they go?
We're talking about express buses, express bus lanes. We're talking about bike access lanes that people can use and feel safe to. We're talking about extending train services and connectivity, right? We're talking about increasing bus lines and bus service. We want to make sure when they made the decisions to cut the bus service lanes, they didn't talk to the community residents to see what the impact was. There were nursing homes and elderly communities that they just eliminated access to. They changed connectivity where the bus was going from stations that had elevators to places that they didn't. I think when we're planning new train stations and new places, we should automatically have incorporated the elevator service, and they failed to do that even when they opened new stations. Again, a lack of planning is not acceptable. We can't accept those things as a community while they did it. Well, they did it, now they're going to have to do $1 billion project because they forgot to put in elevators that service the elderly and the handicapped people of our community. I mean, that's something the Queensborough president and a city councilman had responsibility for. And I want to tell you one thing. When the city councilman say, that's not my area, a city councilman is elected by a particular community, but they represent all of the interests of Queens. So when they sell off the rest of Queens and they try to protect their fiefdoms, their individual communities, they are not to be trusted for an overall plan that services all the community. They all had a responsibility. You get elected by a community, but you service everybody in Queens. And you do us an injustice when you plan selectively and only protect certain people and say you don't care what happens to other parts of Queens, whether they get service or not. And so again, this is why I'm running for Queensborough president, because we have to have an overview of all the things that are impacting our communities and have a better plan, and then have somebody that's willing to have those fights that's not compromised by machine politics.
Okay, well, on that note, thank you very much, Mr. Miranda, for joining me today, and all the best in your campaign.
Thank you so much. You know that the early voting started already, and as I told people, as we are demonstrating in the streets, and we have been demonstrating in the streets, let's demonstrate and lead those protests right to the polling sites. And after we vote, then lead those protests to the offices of all those elected officials who have failed us and hold them accountable. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to our community, and I'm looking forward to seeing it online, your report, when it comes out.